Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ice Time, where we dive into some big ideas around the NHL. I'm Mike Fink, and I'm joined by Ted Starkey, who took some time out of his busy schedule and bared with me through some technical difficulties. So I always appreciate that. Ted covering the NHL, Washington Capitals, which is a little interesting for today's discussion, but NHL, a lot of NHL stuff at Hockey Hot Stove. Has written a few books about the AHL, Washington Capitals, all that stuff. He's been on in the past. Ted, how are you doing?
I'm good, good. We're getting to the good time of the hockey season. Obviously the regular season's wrapping up and getting to see which 16 teams get to play on for the Stanley Cup. And so it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks.
Yeah, we're recording this on Monday before the last Monday of the regular season, which, if you can believe that, playoffs start this weekend. So there's still some things up in the air, but I actually kind of want to get the juices flowing, get the gears churning, whatever phrase you want to use about the playoffs. And that's why I brought you on. Last time you were on, we basically wrapped up the Olympics. That was fun, but now we're previewing the playoffs a bit. And yeah, it's interesting that this season it's a little different. That you don't have the Panthers in, you don't have the Maple Leafs in, you have some new faces, and I think that's where I want to start because I think in the past the playoffs were defined by a few the same sort of teams define the playoffs. Where it was the same teams that would be in the final four every year. And I wonder what team or teams do you think will define the playoffs this season or will kind of tell the story of the playoffs?
Well, I think, obviously the top team is still going to be the Colorado Avalanche. They clinched the President's Trophy, which is, usually the kiss of death for a lot of teams. You haven't had a President's Trophy team win the Stanley Cup since 2013, and team hasn't won in a full season since 2008. So, obviously Colorado looked terrific in the first part of the year, but they've not been quite as dominant down the stretch, and that goaltending is a little bit of a question mark. You also obviously have, you have Dallas, who have kind of ran out of steam in the Western Conference Finals the last 2 years. Can they do it? Obviously Vegas added John Tortorella with a couple games ago, and they've been terrific down the stretch. So does that mean they can kind of break through again? And then, out east, without Florida, Tampa Bay has kind of a clearer path. They've been up and down, but they've obviously got the tools to win the Stanley Cup. And, obviously the Buffalo Sabres are the other team that I think you have to look at. They kind of play an entertaining style uh, for the playoffs the first time since 2011. But how will that translate to, playoff hockey again? And, obviously it'll be interesting to see all those teams. And, obviously I think the East is very wide open. The West, I think you have a little bit more top heavy, but, there's a lot of teams that have legit claims to go deep this year.
Well, I think I brought up the Panthers because I think this is taking a step further. This is what I'm fascinated by, is that the past 3 years the playoffs have been defined by the way the Panthers play. The Panthers play a physical, forechecking style. People would compare them to whether it's the Broad Street Bullies of the past, or some people compare them to the Islanders because they had that physical edge to them, but they also had the skill that when needed, those players that the Matthew Kachucks, the Sam Bennetts, who were physical and big, but could play a skilled game when needed. That team dictated the way the playoffs were played and the way teams were built. And I find what's fascinating is that they're not there anymore. So I think an extra layer to this is, do we see a team that, let's say, it's built on skill? I think you look back to the Lightning and the Avalanche, ironically, who are now in the playoffs and two of the top teams. When they won the cups, it was when both teams won the cup, it was all about the skill they had, or not all about it, but mostly about the skill they had. And it was okay, they could just outscore anyone if needed. If they need to, they could win a game 6-5 and nobody could stop them. The Oilers were also kind of built the same way back then. They've added more physicality, but those are the kind of teams. So I wonder, this time around, do we kind of see a team that's built on skill that they tell the story of the playoffs, or do we maybe just see another version of the Panthers, where another team that it's like, all right, they're built to just bully teams or to grind teams down, and when needed, they can win with skill. I wonder, just that extra layer there, where your mind goes.
I think, ironically, the team that may be like the Panthers this year is the one that Kachuk's brother plays for, the Ottawa Senators, who have obviously been very good down the stretch. They're not as deep as the Panthers are, but they have a lot of sandpaper, which I think, particularly if they end up drawing the Carolina Hurricanes in the first round, that could be significant. They're kind of an in-your-face team. They have decent goaltending. They have some skill. Obviously, like I said, they're not as deep as the Panthers are, but I think they are going to be a very tough out for some teams. The other Eastern wild card team, the Boston Bruins, they have the goaltending. They're not quite as sandpaper as they used to be, but they could also give someone issues. But I kind of see the Senators could be a really, really tough team that just gets in the playoffs, but they could give some teams a lot of issues on, during the playoff series.
I think that's an interesting point with the Senators because now I'm thinking, with that in mind, what if you're building a Cinderella team or you're building a dark horse team that gets in? I know there's a lot of teams that are still up in the air, especially the wild card out west, where there's a bunch of teams where it's like, well, who wants it? And everyone's like, well, who wants to see? It's more of who do you not want to see more or who do you want to see less? And it's like that's kind of what we're deciding between. If you're building a wild card type of team that can go on a run, which team do you like the best here? It's interesting because you have the Senators who have that physical edge, and they have the top end talent that can take over games. Whether it's Kachuk, Tim Stutzla, Jake Sanderson, they just have those stars that can take over games. And the Bruins don't really have that, but they have goaltending. They have elite goaltending that could take over a game. And I wonder, with all that in mind, like what team do you kind of look at and say, okay, they're really built to make some noise or go on a run?
I mean, the interesting thing too is I think whichever Eastern wild card team gets taken in the Metro bracket, they have a very good chance. Because I think, obviously, I think the Atlantic's a lot deeper than the Metro. And like I said, if Ottawa gets into the Metro bracket, you look at them playing Carolina, they're not a bad matchup against Carolina, Pittsburgh, presumably Philadelphia. Either of those teams, they can kind of go toe to toe with those teams. Boston, I think, obviously if they get over to the Metro. They're probably not quite as tough a matchup for Carolina, but they're not going to be an easy out either. And so I think, you have a lot of that. And then the other side, you have Buffalo. Ottawa would probably be a tough matchup for them. There's a lot of former Sabres on that Senators team. And then, obviously Buffalo, Boston's a throwback to the old Adams division and, plenty of playoff series between Boston and Buffalo. So it's going to be interesting. And, obviously, out west, it's a little bit more up in the air, who's going to finish in those wild card spots. But, it's really that middle of that west is just, basically who's going to knock off Colorado, who's going to knock off Dallas, and now probably who's going to knock out Vegas. But, and obviously Edmonton, their goaltending probably isn't as good as it was before, which isn't saying a lot. So, do they go to three straight finals? I kind of doubt it. They've kind of lived a sharp line for 2 years, but it's hard to argue against McDavid at some point.
That's a good thing you mentioned McDavid because that led into the next thing I was thinking about, which is between McDavid and McKinnon, who do you think has more pressure this year to win?
I think McDavid. I mean, just playing in Canada. I mean, I think obviously, McKinnon, they have a cup from a couple of years ago. Colorado's a good hockey market, but they're not a market that's going to basically break you down if you don't win. I mean, I think they expect a lot from the Avalanche. And like I said, obviously they're very good in the first part of the season. But I think they kind of understand how tough the West is. But and they've had a couple seasons the last few years. They've had disappointing playoffs, and obviously they'd like to see it. But the big difference is he's got a cup and McDavid doesn't. And McDavid's got this year and next on his contract, and then where does he end up? Is Edmonton any closer to a cup? Probably not. Like I said, Tristan Jarry has not been a great playoff goaltender, and then Edmonton's kind of hoping that they can get the goaltending to get through again, and I'm not sure they can. But I think McDavid's got a lot of pressure. As I said, just playing in Canada and not having won a cup yet.
I think with it's interesting because I think about it, I'm like the Avalanche. I think have more pressure to win it. But maybe the Avalanche have more pressure. Maybe I mean I know they've won it in the past, but I think there's a little bit of pressure just because of when they last won it in 2022. Everyone's like, this is going to be the next dynasty. They're going to win a bunch of cups, and they haven't won a bunch of cups. They've only won one, and I think there's a little bit of this. Is that it for Nathan McKinnon, Cale Makar, and all those players? And with McKinnon, it's every big game since that it's him coming up short and the Avalanche coming up short. Nathan McKinnon, everyone we talked about the Olympics, him coming up short there, and I mean McDavid has the same sort of story, and it is interesting because I think the Avalanche, it's their they won the President's Trophy. It almost feels like it's their playoff. It's their Stanley Cup playoffs to lose. And with the Oilers, it's interesting. Like it's weird because like maybe I'm alone here, but I feel like there's less pressure this year on the Oilers just because they're not built. Whereas if they were built like the Avalanche and they and they end up winning the Pacific Division, which they could still do, maybe there's going to be more pressure on them. But because this year just they didn't make a run for the cup. They didn't go crazy at the trade deadline. They didn't go all in, and they still have a team that it's like, all right, if we want, we could turn a corner. But it just doesn't seem like. I think it's more of we wouldn't be surprised if they lost. If the Oilers lost, people wouldn't be surprised if they lost versus the Avalanche. If they lose in the first round, or even if they lose in the second round to a Wild or Stars team that's good but not as good as them, there's going to be more of this. Wow, this is it for the President's Trophy winning Avalanche. I wonder if you feel the same about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I was alluding to earlier. I think the problem with the Avalanches might be the goaltending. You have the Wedgwood and the Blackwood, and I think that's their Achilles heel. Obviously they avoided the Minnesota first round, unlike Dallas. It's easy to see potentially Dallas could go down in the first round to Minnesota. Colorado will avoid some of that, but that goaltending. They won the Stanley Cup 4 years ago, kind of despite the goaltending. Kemper got hurt, and it was just kind of they played such a good game ahead of ahead of their goaltending that they were able to win. But this year, is it good enough to hang 4 rounds? I'm not sure. Obviously the West is going to be very, very tough. Maybe you have some upside. At some point you can't play bandwagon hockey in April and May, and they're kind of asking to because they're a super talented team. They're super fast, but at some point you need those saves, and I'm not sure they get them.
And I think with the Oilers, what's interesting is that they were rolling the Stuart Skinner, uh, Calvin Pickard duo, and I think the only thing I would say they have an edge is that Chris Knobloch has a good grasp of goaltending, or they have a good grasp of when they need to manage the position where it's like, all right, we need to bring in the next goalie. And I think whether it's Connor Ingram and Tristan Jarry, yeah, they're both not good, but he'll manage the position well. It's kind of like in baseball terms that manager who knows how to manage the bullpen well and gives them that
Right.
edge. But I think what's interesting is that this time around that he's not the Oilers had the coaching edge in the past 2 years. Now they don't. I don't think Quenneville. If they play Joel Quenneville, they will not have the edge. It's going to be up in the air there. And Tortorella, like we haven't seen Torts in the playoffs in a while, so I actually don't know what we're getting out of him. But maybe he's the type of coach that he could give the Golden Knights an edge in a playoff series. So it's gonna be fascinating there. In the Eastern Conference, it's interesting. I'm shifting back a bit. I want to ask, are we overlooking the Canadians and the Sabres a bit?
I think both teams, I think, have the potential to go deep. I think the East, like I was saying with the East, I think the teams out of the Atlantic are probably the ones that are going to get into the Stanley Cup final. I don't see a Metro team. I mean, Carolina is kind of the same we've always seen. They're not quite as good as they were last year, and I like Boosie in net, but I'm not sure I would trust a guy who's primarily been in the American Hockey League to take a Stanley Cup hopeful to the final. I mean, and Freddie Anderson has not been great this year. So if Boosie kind of buckles under the pressure, they're kind of in no man's land. Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, Pittsburgh's been a great story. They're playing a lot more responsible, but I don't see them beating a Tampa Bay, potentially Buffalo, potentially Montreal. Like you were saying, Montreal is another good team there. They got loads of young talent. Obviously, Cole Caulfield is he hit 50 goals first time a Canadian's got 100 points since Mats Naslund. And obviously Lane Hudson's been terrific. He's probably going to win the Norris Trophy. So, those teams would be very tough. I think the Atlantic is a definite edge over the Metro, and like I was saying, whatever team gets into the Metro 4 could do a lot of damage as well. But Buffalo, I kind of think. I'm not sure their style is going to be really great for the postseason yet. I mean, obviously they needed to get in the playoffs, so they played a more wide open style, and they did. I'm not sure they can get beyond the second round. Montreal, I could see it doing a lot more damage. But like I said, I think, Tampa Bay at the end of the day is probably going to be the team that's going to be the favorite coming out of the East.
It's interesting because that's sort of the narrative in the East, which is and the Atlantic specifically, which is that it's the Lightning and then everyone's like the Lightning are the team to beat, and then there's the Canadians and the Sabres. And I think the story with the Canadians and the Sabres are this is their first or second time in the playoffs. They're still an inexperienced playoff team, which is true for the Sabres. I think the other fascinating part to this is if I were to ask you about both those teams, who's the best player on the Canadians or the Sabres? Either team. I said, who is the best player? Who's that superstar? I don't think you can answer that question. Maybe you can point to a few players say they are the, but there's not a definitive number one player. I think that in a way that gives them an edge in the sense that when you look at the Canadians, it could be anyone that could beat anyone can take over that series on any game. The Sabres, it could be Tage Thompson, it could be Rasmus Dahlin, it could be
Yeah.
Alex Tuck, who's still there and playing on a contract year, which actually he's the only player playing on a contract year, so maybe he's the guy who goes on a Conn Smythe run. That's how it works. You're on a contract year, you end up Nazem Kadri had it a few years ago. Anyway, I digress. But in the Canadians, same way. It could be Cole Caulfield, who scored 51 goals. It could be Nick Suzuki, who has 100 points. It could be Demidov, who's just this skilled rookie. I think I think that's fascinating, and I think with that in mind, does that kind of give them an edge where it's they don't have that one person that can take over series, but they have four or five you could talk yourself into.
Yeah, no, I think, Montreal's got a lot of young talent that's pretty deep, and they have a lot of different ways to beat you. I mean, I think probably the only thing that makes Montreal tougher is just that division. It's going to be a lot, that Atlantic bracket's going to be very tough. You may have to beat Tampa Bay and Buffalo, or, some combination. Even Boston's not a tough out. Uh, any of those teams are really, really good. Ottawa, same thing. You're going to have to beat two very good teams, which probably you won't see in any other division except maybe for Dallas is going to have to beat Minnesota and somebody good. So it's a lot tougher road. And as we've seen in the last couple of years, when you have those two or three rounds that are really tough, you can just end up out of gas by the Western Conference Final, the Eastern Conference Final.
I think that's the irony a bit, where you could have the Central and the Atlantic, which are the top two divisions, where both matchups go 7 games. Because even if you win the Atlantic, you have to face either Ottawa or Boston first, and then you have to face the Atlantic team next. You can be
Right.
beaten up by the time the Eastern Conference comes around, and all of a sudden a well rested team that is in the Metro that's not necessarily better, but isn't doesn't go through those battles has the edge there. And it's interesting. The same thing could happen. It's happened with the Oilers in the past where they have not had a tough road and they cruise through the Pacific and then they play a Stars team that's been beaten up and it gives them that
Yep.
edge. So it is interesting with that in mind that maybe that's why we're just kind of taking with a grain. I mean, the Lightning have done it before, so I think we've seen that they can, but some of these teams that haven't, we haven't seen it. All right, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back.